For this, the first of our Aquinas Lectures for this year, 2023. Now, there are many reasons why Aquinas deserves to be read. He's an unsurpassed exponent of Christian doctrine. He has contributed in a definitive way to many ideas in the history of Christianity, an architect of the university. But this series of lectures is convinced that Aquinas is not only deserving of a reading, he's also relevant. He has something to say which is of crucial importance to our historical moment. And the first of our lectures speaks to the question of science, and in particular to the question of the origin of our species. And I'm delighted to welcome back to Blackfriars Professor Mariusz Tabaczek from the Pontifical University of St. Thomas Aquinas in Rome. Mariusz is a member of the Thomistic Institute as well as a professor of theology. His work explores an extraordinary range and breadth of theological and philosophical questions, so many that I'm going to have to read them off his biography. He's especially interested in science, theology, dialogue, divine action, creation theology, evolutionary theory. He's worked on the philosophy of nature, the philosophy of science, causation, metaphysics, various types of hylomorphism, classical and contemporary analytical concepts of causation, emergence, science-orientated critiques of pantheism, and various aspects of divine action within the universe. He has a huge range of articles in print and two books, Emergence Towards a New Metaphysics and Philosophy of Science, published by University of Notre Dame Press in 2019, and Divine Action and Emergence, an Alternative to Panentheism, published by the University of Notre Dame in 2020. He has a book coming, I think, this year by Cambridge University Press, which is examining a contemporary Aristotelian Thomistic view of the theistic evolution. His lecture today is entitled Contemporary Views on Anthropogenesis, an Aristotelian Thomistic Contribution. And we look forward, Professor, to what you have to say. Please welcome Professor Mariusz Tabaczek.
Thank you very much, Father Oliver, for the introduction. Thank you very much for the invitation and to all of you for coming. Yes, when we think about the theory of evolution and the Catholic theological philosophical reaction and response to it, we may be sure that anthropogenesis inspired the most emotional reactions to evolutionary theory and posed a considerable challenge both to systematic and philosophical theology. So in my presentation tonight, I will proceed in the following way, addressing some of the most important, I believe, aspects of this conversation. First, I will simply refer to what Aquinas says about the origin of man and woman. Then I will speak or mention some aspects of the Catholic Church and its evolution in its reaction to evolutionary anthropogenesis, some selected aspects of this reaction. And then I will propose what I call a contemporary Thomistic version of the semi-naturalistic view of anthropogenesis. And then I will, hopefully there will be time to address some arguments or just the debate on mono and polygenism, but I will concentrate on monogenism, arguments in favor of monogenism, and my critical evaluation of the contemporary version of this monogenetic scenario of the origin of our species. So there's a lot that I would like to cover. Hopefully I will manage to do that during this lecture. Okay, so first, just a reminder, I believe to most of you, but it is important for our conversation, Aquinas on the origin of man and woman. So Aquinas, in this area, he basically rather literally reads the Genesis because it fits with the science of his time in a way, or one way or the other. So when he thinks about, so he obviously recognizes the spiritual or metaphysical, we may say, aspect or immaterial aspect of human being, of man. This is soul for him. He claims obviously that it is not of the substance of God, And then he proceeds and comes to the conclusion that it has to be produced, this is the term he uses, but we would rather say created ex nihilo by God. This is his conclusion. Now, this creation of human soul for him is immediate, so this is direct divine action of creation ex nihilo, and he speaks this against Neo-Platonic philosophy, where we have intermediaries of creation or things that are created by God. But from our perspective, not yet here. Okay, let's leave it like this. And then human souls, importantly, do not pre-exist. This is important. Aquinas says it would have been unfitting for the soul to be created without the body. So he would say they are created with the body. Okay. Now, coming to the second aspect of human beings, body of the first man, Aquinas says, is formed from the slime of the earth. So again, he literally rather reads the Bible on this. And again, important for us here, this formation of human body was immediate again. So there is no intervention or there's no intermediary here, neither angels nor created material beings that would somehow be involved in the formation of human body. When it comes to Eve, the first woman was made from the first man, made from a rib of Adam. And again, for Aquinas, this is an immediate action by God that happens instantaneously. So having or realizing all this in terms of what Aquinas thinks about the origin of first man and first woman, we may ask a question: is his understanding of the origin of the human species in any way relevant to evolutionary anthropogenesis? So one might say not really, because again, his interpretation is rather literal. And I would add to this that it has some dualistic overtones, even within the philosophical, theological assessment, right? When he says that soul is created with the body, that could be interpreted that there is a separate substance which is the body and the separate spiritual substance which is soul, and they are somehow joined together. And also again, he is constrained by the biology of his time, so why would he be relevant today? Well, I would try to show that he is relevant in terms of some principles in his philosophy and theology that do prove to be useful in the context of the reaction of the church to Darwin's theology of evolution, especially today, when the church, we may say, embraced in one way or the other evolutionary synthesis. So, but before I will speak about the contemporary situation, just few references to the history of the way in which the church reacted to the idea of evolutionary anthropogenesis. So the first reaction, as some of you may know, comes very early. It is the year 1860, when a synod of Cologne, or took place in Cologne, the local synod, which strongly reacted against evolutionary theory. And in one part of the documents of the synod, we read something important. Here is this passage: the first parents were created directly by God, and it is contrary to sacred scripture and to the faith. The opinion is contrary, that would assert that man, insofar as his body is concerned, came to be by a spontaneous change from imperfect nature to the most perfect. Now, it is important because it tells us that 1 year after Darwin publishes his book, within Catholic circles, there is already the idea that body is formed by evolution and soul comes from divine creation. So, the first, we may say, official reaction of the church is against precisely this theory, when it emphasizes that body also comes from direct creation or action, divine action. Now, there is a long conversation and discussion precisely on this synod. and there are many questions that are being asked. First, to what extent this synod is anti-evolutionary in principle, or to what extent it is reacting towards already reductionist and materialist versions of evolutionary theory that are popular in Germany. There is a lack of consensus also at this point when the synod takes place as to whether direct formation of the human body is an article of faith. Today we know that it is not, and it never has been. There is a complex theological and cultural context of the synod in Germany because of, first, the historical critical interpretation of the scripture that is growing, especially in Germany at this time, and also Ernst Haeckel, a famous biologist and philosopher of biology, a strong supporter of Darwin in Germany, who works in biology, developmental biology, and he supports Darwin against, in a way that he thinks that Darwin speaks straightforwardly against Christianity and especially Catholicism. So this synod might be a reaction to this, context of academia in Germany. There is also the question concerning the level of magisterial teaching of this local synod. Simon Gain, who comes from Oxford, now also in Rome, he and others, they claim that the documents of the synod were accepted and approved but for the local church in Germany, but not for the entire church, which is important from the perspective of the history of evolutionary theory and reaction to it coming from the Catholic Church. And Kenneth Camp, an important historian and philosopher of science from the United States of America, he claims or suggests that this synod actually does not react to Darwin, because Darwin's book is still in translation into German at this time when the synod meets, whereas Chambers' book on vestiges of the natural history of creation has already a second edition that comes a year before the synod meets, and it is popular again in Germany. So Kemp claims that the synod might be responding not to Darwin but to other evolutionary ideas that are circulating in academia. But from my perspective, what is also very important is again what I would call or name as a dualistic terminology, where we have this claim about body and then a claim about soul and the origin of body and the origin of soul, explained in a way that may suggest that they are somehow separated and they come together. Now, what happens next is the development of natural science, but also biblical criticism and biblical archaeology. So in natural science, we have more and more evidence in support of the theory that human beings come from lower animals, in morphology, in biochemistry, and also in growing fossil evidence, where gradually this view is being built and proposed, which is, a commonly accepted view among biological evolutionists of the origin of the human species. And then we have historical critical exegesis, I mentioned it already, which uncovers a complex origin and the entire and triggers the entire debate about the authorship of the Pentateuch. And we know today that it was not one person, Moses, who wrote it 2000 years before Christ. And then we have biblical archaeology, which uncovers and shows many references to pagan creation myths and also pagan stories about the origin of human beings, where we see many references to the story that is shared in the Bible. So the epic Enuma Elish, Atrahasis epic, or the Egyptian narrative of the potter god who forms human being on his potter's wheel are good examples. So the church takes all this into account, and a new reinterpretation of the account in Genesis is being offered gradually, a new reinterpretation which may be summarized in reference to recently deceased Pope Benedict XVI, who as Pope says in 1995 this: taking into account all that I mentioned here, we now should agree that the story of the dust of the earth and the breath of God does not in fact explain how human persons came to be, but rather what they are: material and spiritual creatures with relational capacity. As a theologian many years earlier, with respect to the origin of Eve, again, Ratzinger says, the text on the creation of Eve does not want to answer the question of how it came to pass that a woman began to exist. Rather, it wants to answer the question of what kind of being the woman is and what mystery lies in the relationship between man and woman. Now, he says this, again, in reference to everything we learn from evolutionary biology, but he is also careful when it comes to evolutionary biology. It is a separate chapter which I will not address here, Benedict XVI approach to evolutionary theory, which changed over years with respect and in reference to what Cardinal Schönborn thought about this and intelligent design movement. It is an interesting topic. If you are interested, I can give you references. But in 1995, in his Catechesis on Creation, he says that the theory of evolution seeks to understand and describe biological developments, but in so doing, it cannot explain where the project of human persons comes from, nor their inner origin, nor their particular nature. So he expresses here the thought that will be later on picked up by John Paul II, where famously he states that there is both continuity and an ontological discontinuity between lower animals and human beings. So this distinct signs of distinctively human being, we may think of metaphysical knowledge, self-consciousness, moral conscious, freedom, and aesthetic and religious experience. These are the signs that must be subjected to philosophical analysis, says John Paul II, and we may add that at their root on the traditional Catholic analysis is rationality, that is the powers of intellect and will and their acts both on the speculative and practical side. Now the whole problem that we have is to capture this continuity and discontinuity, right? This is the challenge that the church faces. And now the first attempt to do so was precisely this theory that was found controversial and criticized by the Synod in Cologne. It was developed and formally for the first time proposed by St. George Jackson Mivart, who in his book published in 1871, that is the year when Darwin publishes his On the Origin of Man, this is what says Jackson Mivart. The scripture says that God made man from the dust of the earth. This is a plain and direct statement that man's body was evolved from pre-existing material symbolized by the term dust of the earth and was therefore formed by the operation of secondary laws. So he's applying Aristotelian-Thomistic terminology here. The soul, on the other hand, of every individual man is created, that is produced by a direct or supernatural act, and of course by such an act the soul of the first man was similarly created. So again we have this distinction here between the origin of the body and the origin of the soul. Now this thought was then followed by several important thinkers. One of them was John Augustine Zahm at the University of Notre Dame in Indiana, and in Italy Filippo de Filippi, a naturalist interested also in theological aspects of evolution and human speciation, and he expressed his thoughts in his lecture titled L'uomo e la scimmia. So this is a quotation from Zam. Zam again supports Mivart when he says we should be obliged to revise the interpretation that has usually been given to the words of scripture which refer to the formation of Adam's body and read these words in the sense which evolution demands. Now, this thought is controversial in the context of the time when it is formulated, but I will not address the reaction of the church to this idea here, because what interests me is the very idea, because I think my approach is more ontological than historical here. Now, the church, when the church, or after the church embraces, we may say, evolution in 1950 in Humani Generis, it is many years, it is actually precisely in this document, where the church uses the same language and analogy that is developed by Mivart and others. So this is the quotation from Humani Generis, which opening, when opening the Catholic reflection, the philosophical and theological reflection, opening it to the theory of evolution, Pope Pius XII says this: so the teaching of the authority of the church does not forbid to think with reference or with regard to the doctrine of evolution about the human origins, but importantly, the way is open to think in this way about the origin of the human body as coming from pre-existing and living matter. At the same time, the Catholic faith obliges us to hold that souls are immediately created by God. John Paul II, in many years later, he will confirm and repeat this teaching when he says, if the human body takes its origin from pre-existing living matter, the spiritual soul is immediately created by God. So this is the, I would call it, semi-naturalistic approach to the origin of man, which the way it is formulated by the church. Now, do we like it as Aristotelian Thomistic scholars or not? Well, this is the question I ask. So I think that there are some problems with this formulation. There is again this difficulty, in my opinion, of dualistic overtones of this version of semi-naturalistic view. They are expressed also, this is not just my thought, they are expressed by Ratzinger, who, he said it earlier on, but I did not have time. I mean, this is my fault. I should have checked sources. This is the most recent edition of this, of his words, of this statement, where he says, where he asks a question towards this theory that I have just shared. Can we divide up men in this way between theologians and sciences? The soul for theologians and the divine direct creation, and the body for evolution and natural origin within evolutionary processes. And I think he's right to ask this question. From the Aristotelian-Thomistic perspective, we have to say this: there's no human body without human soul. So it is really awkward to say that evolution produced the body and then the soul came somehow to this body. Why? Because an already informed entity, a body, cannot receive an additional substantial form. That would be, in this case, a human soul. And this is because, and I want to emphasize it, the proper correlate of substantial form, which is a metaphysical principle, must be another metaphysical principle, that is primary matter as the source of potentiality or pure potentiality. This primary matter may be actualized in some way such that there is a physical entity but this physical entity has to enter into substantial change where a new entity comes into existence, which is an entity of a new kind, for there to be a change of the kind that we think about here. So, in my opinion, the final step of hominization according to this theory that is proposed in Humani Generis and later on, suggests an unusual and strange substantial change. If we assume that a human soul cannot be added to a human body, then we would have to have a strange substantial change where we have an adult hominid or hominin organism which goes through a substantial change such that physically nothing changes, but it becomes a completely a new species. Now, that is metaphysically awkward, and we can also raise some theological objections. Following Aquinas, we may make an argument from fittingness, and we may ask, is it fitting for God, if he wants us and our species to belong to the fabric of this universe, is it fitting for God to introduce this species through this unusual and weird substantial change, rather than introduce this species the way other species are being introduced? And other species are being introduced according to, I believe, what I believe this system of philosophy and theology would say. They are introduced through a substantial change which happens in the moment of conception of a new organism, which happens to be the first organism of new species. So I think that this picture where the soul enters a human body that evolved is imprecise and is metaphysically wrong, I dare to say. And I suggest that first human souls were, yes, created ex nihilo, or first human soul, at the moment of conception of the first human being, and then they actualized properly disposed primary matter, which underlay gametes produced by male and female hominins at the moment of substantial change, which accompanied fertilization. Now, the first formulation of this view, or in some aspects of this view, was offered by a French Dominican already in 1891, Marie d'Almac-Leroy. He says this: it is only after the infusion of the soul, I don't like the language of infusion, but he uses it, and because of the infusion itself, that man is constituted a living being. Before infusing the spirit, there was nothing human, not even the body, inasmuch as human flesh cannot exist without the soul, which is its substantial form. Now, this is grounded in Aristotle, definitely, where he says this in his Parts of Animals, and you could find other passages. When the soul departs, what is left is no longer a living animal, and none of the parts remain what they were before, excepting in configuration. Now, Thomas Aquinas has important passage in his commentary on the Anima of Aristotle. This is crucial here. I quote Aquinas: "We must not think, therefore, of the soul and body as though the body had its own form, making it a body, and to which a soul is superadded, making it a living body. The body gets both its being and its life from the soul. Therefore, when life departs from the body, when life departs, the body is not left specifically the same. The eyes and flesh of a dead man are only improperly called eyes and flesh. When the soul leaves the body, another substantial form takes its place. Again, in Summa Contra Gentiles, the eye and flesh of a dead thing are so called only in an equivocal sense." There is this difficulty of precision here, of imprecision here. We don't bury body, we bury a cadaver, which is not a human body. Human body is this, okay? So therefore, trying to build a model of evolutionary transition or speciation, human speciation, I have a broader model that I built to depict or explain divine and creaturely causation in any evolutionary transition, but I will share here an application of my model to human speciation. What is important in this model is that when we think about Aquinas and his understanding of what entities, or in this case organisms, are, we have existence and essence, as I believe you know and remember. But in terms of existence, I suggest we should distinguish three aspects of existence. These are coming into existence at t0, continuing existence through time, and existence as such from a metaphysical and ontological perspective. So my claim would be that God is the author of all these aspects of existence, but he can and does bring or exercise or gives this existence to contingent creatures through other contingent creatures working either as secondary or instrumental causes. So existence as such will be given to creatures through other creatures only instrumentally, because this is something that creatures cannot give of themselves, but God can give that through them. When it comes to essence, on the other hand, I suggest essence has two important aspects to it. Educing a substantial form from the potentiality of primary matter, and primary matter and substantial form as such. Again, both of them come ultimately from God, but again, my claim would be that God can and wants to bring to educe substantial form from the potency of matter. He can and wants to do that through secondary causes. And when it comes to primary matter and substantial form as such, these are perfections that no creature can give them, but they of themselves, but they can give them as instruments through which God is giving them. Okay, so I distinguish here between secondary and instrumental causes. So taking all this into account, we distinguish the transcendent order of causation and immanent order of causation. In the immanent order of causation, we have a very complex matrix of causes that contribute to the speciation, right? And what I depict here is just the last stage of this process that is extended in time and space, and we have maternal and paternal organisms that exist and have their essence, and they procreate, and what comes from this procreation is the first exemplar of a new species, which is depicted by an organism that has substantial form S2, substantial form of new type. Now, thinking about human evolution, we have to acknowledge that God is here the primary cause of human soul. And according to what the church believes, this comes directly from God through his direct creation ex nihilo. But but substantial form, which is human soul in this case, it actualizes primary matter. Primary matter is also created by God, Aquinas would say. But in this case, we may say that this primary matter is properly disposed to be actualized by the first human soul created by God. It is disposed within those natural processes of evolution. Therefore, those parental organisms might be considered secondary causes, again, of proper disposition of this primary matter to be actualized by first human soul. When it comes to existence, again, God is the first cause of all three aspects of existence: coming into existence, existing in time, and existence as such. But I claim that, and Aquinas, I believe, would agree with me, that when it comes to coming into existence again and existing in time, God works here through secondary causes of parental organisms. They are secondary causes of this coming into existence and sustaining in existence of their offspring, which here happens to be the first exemplar of the human species. And when it comes to existence as such, again, the same parental organisms may be considered to be instrumental causes of the existence as such of their offspring. Now, what is important here, there is no human body produced by evolution and human soul that is added by God from outside of this process. No, what evolves is life and living organisms. And what comes into existence within those processes of evolution is human being. Yes, human soul is created ex nihilo by God, but this human soul actualizes primary matter which is properly disposed within those evolutionary processes, such that there is no human body that pre-exists for even a second without a human soul, and human soul which pre-exists for even a second before it enters human body. Human souls never pre-exist. Human souls are created in human beings. They can subsist, but they never subsist before they are this. They only subsist after our death, and this is crucial here. So I believe that within this explanation, we avoid this difficulty of dualist approach where we have body created or made by evolution and soul coming from the outside. Now, this is the first part that finishes here. Now, even if we agree with what I propose here, we have another problem here, which is a problem of monogenism and polygenism. And it is a considerable problem from the point of view of Christianity and Catholicism as well. Because why? Because biology simply favors polygenism. Darwin assumes a polygenic origin of species, and modern synthetic theory of evolution supports the same view, both the synthesis from the 20th century and the current developing new evolutionary synthesis. Dobrzański, one of the fathers of the 20th century synthetic theory of evolution, says species arise not as single individuals but as diverging populations breeding communities. So today we believe in biology that human species has monophyletic origin. It comes from one other species, not many species, but it comes into existence in a polygenetic way, and multi-regionalism is assumed. Again, different regions, but within one larger population. Okay, the difficulty of the theory assuming monogenism is an extremely narrow bottleneck effect. In the classical understanding of monogenism, the population has to go down to very few organisms, eventually to one or two, and they go through this last step of speciation, and then they procreate and produce a new large population. According to evolutionary genetics, this cannot happen. It's virtually impossible. So Denis Venema is an evolutionary biologist, but also a Christian, an author that writes about evolutionary speciation of human beings. He says that we assume today that this first population has had at least several thousand individuals. And he even claims that based on most recent research, we may assume that there was no significant change in human population size at the time modern humans appeared in the fossil record, or at the time of significant cultural and religious development. In another book that he co-authors with McKnight, he says it is technically possible that a species could be formulated by a single ancestral breeding pair, but this is not what one would usually expect, according again to the laws of population genetics. Now then, so this is biology. At the same time, in theology, we have a number of arguments in favor of monogenism. These are biblical arguments, if one would still want to read, but human Genesis more literally. But it's interesting that we have a difficulty here because most of the contemporary exegetes, they agree that we should not read Genesis account literally, and dogmatic theologians agree, but many of them, when it comes precisely to the origin of man and of the human species, they would like to stick to one Adam and one Eve. So there is a difficulty here. Other references in the scriptures, at least two other important references, the Book of Wisdom, which speaks about wisdom preserving the first formed father of the world when he alone has been or had been created, and the Acts of the Apostles, which speak about the one from whom the entire human race came into existence. But this one, I mean, it doesn't say Adam, it doesn't introduce the noun man, so you could interpret it in various ways, but we may assume that when Paul, this is part of Paul's speech in Athens, he means Adam. But this is the Bible. But then we have Humani Generis, which opens the dialogue or a possibility to think evolutionary about human origins, but precisely here, when it comes to polygenism, it says that this freedom is not there. The faithful cannot embrace that opinion which maintains that either after Adam there existed on this earth true men who did not take their origin through natural generation from him as from the first parent of all, or that Adam represents a certain number of first parents. What he actually does in this phrase, he speaks both against polyphyletism and polygenism. Now, why is it impossible to think in this way? It is in no way apparent, says the document, how such an opinion can be reconciled with the teaching about original sin. So the Pope says it would be difficult to think about this entire tradition that is built on this analogy, one Adam, one Christ. Paul VI, he organizes a conference on original sin in 1966, and in his address, he speaks against polygenism even stronger. He speaks about the undemonstrated hypothesis of polygenism, and those modern authors that refer to it and give explanations of original sin, which are irreconcilable with Catholic doctrine because they deny exactly this analogy of one Adam, one Christ. Now, those who like monogenism and favor monogenism, they at some point they found a fascinating proof in science. This is at least what they thought at the time. The idea of mitochondrial Eve and Y chromosomal Adam. The mitochondrial DNA comes only from the mother because it's in ovum. The sperm leaves it behind when it enters ovum. And this mitochondrial DNA, the claim is that we could examine it from one generation to next, going backwards, and we would arrive at the first mother of the species Homo sapiens, and that would be mitochondrial Eve. Similar with the Y chromosome that is in male representatives of our species. Now, there was a fascination and enthusiasm for this argument, especially within Protestant evangelical circles. But then a criticism of this argument came, which showed, and it is accepted now by most scholars, that all that it says is that all currently living human beings may have this one first mother and father, but it doesn't prove that those organisms were the only one living human beings at the time. So, in other words, this is quotation from Venema again. The present-day variation of human chromosomal DNA indicates that this mitochondrial Eve was but one member of a substantial breeding population, and the same logic refers to this idea of Y chromosomal Adam. So he says that it ceases to be an argument that will be convincing, a convincing argument in favor of monogenism coming from science. So can we defend monogenism today? Well, in the Catholic circles, we have a proposition that was developed most recently by Kenneth Kemp, whom I mentioned before, in his influential and important paper published in 2011, but you can see already two other names that came with similar ideas before. So they try to marry monogenism with biological polygenism. So how do they do this? So here is the scenario that is proposed by Andrew Alexander first in 1964. I think this is actually the most important paper which builds on Miller, that I will mention in a minute, and then is again rethought and reintroduced by Kemp in 2011. So Alexander speaks about three phases of hominization. We have so he says that there are three stages of this process. First one is the emergence of the biological human species, which is the population of interbreeding individuals, simply. It assumes biological definition of species. I leave aside the entire conversation on the definition of species in biology. Then he speaks about philosophical species, the philosophical human species, where it would be a rational animal already, a natural kind characterized by the capacity for conceptual thought, judgment, reasoning, and even free choice. And the last stage in this process would be the situation where we have the collection of individuals that have or discover that they have this eternal destiny. Creatures that are capable of receiving supernatural grace. Now, Alexander claims that the final step towards this theological human species was a particular and crucial genetic mutation, which nonetheless did not establish biological barriers to reproduction. So you could then have one or two first theological human beings who come into existence, but they can procreate not only among themselves, but they can procreate with other philosophical human beings, right? So therefore, you do not have this narrow bottleneck effect. And still you have theological monogenism, one or two first theological human beings coming into existence, but they come within biological polygenism. Now, Alexander builds on the premature version of this argument proposed by Camille Miller, who said that Adam and Eve coexisted with a wider biologically human population. Now, but Miller has a different final step. The conclusive step of the hominization for him hinges on God's elevating human soul through the gift of sanctifying grace, which developed in the first theological, well, now I'm imposing the category of theological human being that comes from Alexander. But the crucial point is this, that the final step is only the gift of sanctifying grace. Nothing changes in biological aspects or physical aspects. It's just the gift of grace. And then through the successive union of the descendants of several primitive couples, a very limited number of generations would be enough for all men to be descended from the first man of which Genesis speaks. And then he concludes, this would be monogenism, less strict, right? Because monogenism within biological polygenism, but equally efficacious, and then we can we can accept the version that comes to us through Genesis, the story about one Adam and one Eve. Now, the difficulties of his position from my perspective are at least two. Well, if the final step is just the gift of grace, we have a problem here, because we would then have hominins, biological and philosophical humans, to again impose Alexander's categories, having immortal souls before the divine bestowal of sanctifying grace, right? Because if only the gift of sanctifying grace changes them into real human beings, then we would have, well, according to Aquinas' categories, natura pura, right? The situation where we have already a human being, which is a human being with immortal soul, but without the gift of grace. And then the other difficulty would be the fact that supernatural gift of grace seems to be then an integral part of human nature, because you don't become a human being truly and entirely without the gift of grace. So therefore we have this entire then problem in the debate on nature and grace. Now Kenneth Kemp and his version of this entire argument. In 2011, I believe, I might be wrong, here. I think it was 2011 where he published his article. He says this, that Alexander's idea of the crucial, because Alexander he, as I said, he introduces those three separate categories: biological, philosophical, and theological human being, and he has this genetic mutation that enables a philosophical human being to become a creature that is open to the gift of sanctifying grace, which is obviously a gift that comes from above. Now, Kenneth Kemp doesn't like the idea of this final mutation, crucial mutation, and he thinks this misplaced, as it would have to spontaneously affect two organisms, male and female. To which I respond saying, well, why presuppose that the mutation in one organism, either male or female, would not be enough within this model where whether it is just one organism or two, they can procreate with hominins and produce fertile offspring, which is which belongs to the species of Homo sapiens. So I don't see the problem here with there being just mutation in one organism. But at the same time, from the other point of view, or on the other hand, why assume that the same mutation could not occur in two organisms? Today we know that many mutations are very specific and they target precise loci in particular parts of genomes. Nevertheless, Kenneth Kemp rejects the idea that the final mutation is crucial here, and he suggests this. We may assume that an account or alternative to Alexander, which begins with a population of about 5,000 hominids, he assumes, and he says God selects two and endows them with intellects by creating for them rational souls, giving them at the same time preternatural gifts. Now, this is interesting that he introduces the category of preternatural gifts, which is another complex subject of another complex debate today, whether we should dismiss at least some of them or reformulate or reinterpret some of those preternatural gifts. So where other authors that I mentioned don't refer to those preternatural gifts that much, he reintroduces them. Now, in my opinion, what happens here, we have God who arbitrarily and without reference to any biological change selects two hominins and endows them with intellects by creating for them rational souls. So they don't become Homo sapiens only by the gift of grace. No, they become Homo sapiens with the gift or by being given those rational souls, according to Kemp. Now, I claim that this proposition, while correct in its basic presupposition, is voluntaristic, again, because it depends, the final step of the speciation, human speciation, depends again on this God's arbitrary decision without a particular natural condition that enables the final step. I think it's still dualistic. Human souls are added to otherwise almost rational human beings, which I claim is unacceptable from the Aristotelian-Thomistic point of view, which Kemp wants to follow. So I had two, at least, conversations with Kenneth Kemp in Rome, and I shared my concerns with him. And he recently, this year, actually, in January, he published another article which basically summarizes his position. And unfortunately, he repeats, in my opinion, similar mistakes or imprecise claims that I'm criticizing here. And I think, again, that this claim or this model is metaphysically dubious because, again, it suggests this strange and unusual substantial change of an adult organism. I think that concerning points 2 and 3, Kemp could easily amend his position, saying that God creates the first human souls that actual as primary matter at the moment of conception. But again, as I told you, he did not do that. He doesn't want to change it. But the first point seems to be more of a problem in his model. I think that, and claim in my upcoming book in the last chapter on anthropogenesis, that this divine voluntarism that in one way or the other Kemp is introducing or introduces is typical of William of Ockham and some post-Reformation theologians, but it is rather foreign to Aquinas. It is very important for Aquinas that God's agency takes always into account the nature of things. This is not voluntarism, not pure intellectualism, but it is the middle ground between these two. God takes into account the nature of things and works through them as secondary and instrumental causes. So I would rather suggest that God's direct creation of the first human soul corresponds to the proper, again, disposition of primary matter within the complex processes of speciation, where secondary causes are important, and there must be some physical, biological change that, again, disposes primary matter to be actualized by human soul, such that so that the first human being comes into existence. When the gametes meet and merge in fertilization in a particular generation, moment of generation of new organism. And this substantial change or this occurrence, the fertilization, is a substantial change that gave origin to the first modern human beings. And it was possible, again, on my account, because of some decisive natural change in the biological material that prepared and disposed a primary matter. So, consequently, distancing my own position from on this matter from both occasionalism and deism, as well as divine voluntarism, I am more inclined to follow Alexander's original position rather than the one offered by Kemp. So this is monogenism. Now, the last thing I will do, and I will finish with this, obviously monogenism is not the only position that is being defended here, and there is a number of arguments coming from Catholic philosophers and theologians in favor of polygenism and the ways in which it could be reconciled with the Bible. So I'll just list the most important arguments and leave it there because there's no time to discuss them. I do that in my book. There are scriptural arguments. Genesis in the first chapter speaks about all humans and human nature rather than particular human beings. So one could argue that Adam and Eve in the second, third, and fourth chapter of Genesis are instantiations, selected instantiations of the wider family of human beings. That are put by God in this garden, which is part of the broader reality of created earth. But then in reference to an argument again emphasized by Pius XII in Humani Generis, the analogy of Adam and Christ has to take into account today also Eve. And actually, we know that Eve is the first one who actually commits this the sin in Genesis. So the claim is this: if we have already in Genesis the community of two human beings in sin, so why couldn't we think about the wider population of human beings that collectively commit a sin? Well, you could go to Gospel of John. I mean, there's a number of, I'm just bringing the most important scriptural arguments. One of them says that John, in the first chapter of his Gospel, speaks about the sin of the world, where it could be again understood collectively. And then we have a crucial paragraph, a crucial verse, I'm sorry, in the letter to Romans, where the Vetus Latina version that Augustine read, on which in a way he built the notion of original sin, was wrong, and this translation says that sin passed to all in whom all have sinned, in Adam in whom all have sinned. Today we know that the proper translation would be this: that passed to all because all have sinned. So those who are in favor of polygenism would use also this and say, well, the sin came to the world because all of the human beings that existed at the beginning of human species that takes place in a population collectively committed the first sin. And then they also, the proponents of polygenism, they within the theological circles, they say, well, we have to go back to Humani Generis and see exactly what Pope says there, because the Pope says it doesn't seem possible to bring together the doctrine of sin and polygenism. But the question is whether that closes the debate, or it says at the current stage of development of theology it is not possible, with an opening for this maybe for this being possible maybe in the future. So just one last sentence or a few sentences on this, because there is a considerable debate precisely on this point. As you can imagine. So Kenneth Kemp, he's actually finishing a large book on the entire history of the response to evolution in the Catholic circles, both theological circles and the magisterium. Wonderful, it's going to be a great resource, and he worked for years on it. But part of this research was, while working on this book, he worked in the archives and he checked all the versions of Humani Generis. And he his article on this will come out next few weeks, I believe, in the journals Scienza et Fides, and I was reviewer of that article. And in this article, he shows how the first text was much stronger anti-polygynist in its character, and then the critique was softened. But he also shows in this article that the entire conversation that took place right after the encyclical letter was published led to the situation where the Pope asked the same theologians who worked on encyclical letter to address the same issue once again, but they couldn't come to the conclusion that would be acceptable for all of them. And the Pope eventually, in one of, I think, more unofficial contexts, said that what he said in the encyclical letter, what I said, he said, and I close at least my intervention at this point, which according to Kemp should be understood as an opening for further debate rather than closing it. Okay, that's all I have for tonight. If you are interested in the Aristotelian-Thomistic approach to evolutionary theory, these are the most important references, I believe, with a number of my articles and the title of my upcoming book that hopefully will come this year from Cambridge. So thank you very much for your attention, and I believe there is some time for questions.
Thank you very much, Mariusz. If you just sit at that microphone for the moment, but really an enlightening paper and really full of nuance and information and right at the cutting edge of this. So thank you. We're very much in your debt. At this point, we say farewell to those who are joining us on the live stream, but we do have time for questions and discussion in the room if anyone